Welcome everyone to Defining Burnout, and this evening we're presenting the Global Workplace Burnout Study 2021. So my name is Alexis Zana and I am the founder and facilitator at Human Leaders, which is an online peer-to-peer learning community for leaders at all levels. So we do have a number of our wonderful Human Leaders community with us in the call tonight. And we also have a number of wonderful potential community members joining us from LinkedIn. Tonight's session is quite a special session. Generally speaking, these live expert-led webinars are an exclusive piece of our Human Leaders community. However, I felt that this body of work and this particular study, we just couldn't do it merit within our community. So we decided to make this one-off session this evening publicly available to our community on LinkedIn as well. So we're really, really excited to be here this evening, hosting so many of you from around the world in this session. And we're also delighted to have so many of our own Human Leaders community joining this session. So this evening's session is, as I mentioned, on burnout. And we have the wonderful Sally Clarke joining us this evening. She's the co-author and co-researcher on the Global Workplace Burnout Study 2021. And before I pass over to Sally, I just want to give a little bit of background as to why this topic is so important for us in leadership and in organizations right now. And it's very interesting because I met Sally and I came across her extremely important research in a very roundabout way. I was actually, for those who perhaps follow me on LinkedIn or have connected with me before on LinkedIn, you'll know that I publish a lot of studies from around the world, statistics and things like that on leadership issues. And I'd actually been collating and published some information last year that was from an Asana report that reported on burnout levels being around 80% and even higher in some countries during the pandemic. And I personally just was mind blown by these statistics. The thought that so many of our colleagues, friends and family members were suffering through a time like this just felt very pressing to me. And at the time, something that I wanted to bring to light to the global sort of leadership community. And interestingly in that, Sally came across my post and she very eloquently, very delightfully messaged me and said, "Oh, I'm so glad to find someone else speaking about burnout. However, I'm not sure if you are aware of this, but some of the data is actually over-reporting burnout and just how bad this phenomenon was." And I paused for a moment and I thought, I wonder what on earth she could be talking about here. And I replied back to her and said, "Please tell me more. What am I missing?" And Sally so beautifully took the time to catch up with me and explain to me some of the very important components of burnout that so many of us perhaps miss in our understanding of it. Now, I'm not going to dive into that too much this evening. I'll leave that for Sally. However, just before we started, I wanted to quickly touch on a few small polls and questions that I've been throwing out to my community lately that I think helps us set the scene in our own understanding of burnout. And then my hope is that Sally will illuminate the gaps for us through her research and help us understand that a little more. So I'm hoping you can see my screen. Whoops, I've just done a real doozy on Canva. I'm hoping that you can see my screen here on the slide. So this slide are two different polls that I ran in the past week, one via LinkedIn and one via our Human Leaders community. So the first one on the left was a really simple slider question. Basically, you marked on a scale where on the scale you felt you had suffered from burnout in your career. So you can see my own vote there as well. I've had in my career so far, as a corporate marketing consultant, working for some of Australia's leading media agencies, I've felt that in my career I'd suffered a pretty significant level of burnout. So you can see there my score is up in the orange and there is a few down in the blue, which indicate perhaps they haven't suffered from burnout at all in their career either. So that's a poll that we ran within our community. And the reason I wanted to do that was just to get a feel, firstly, for how many of us thought that we had suffered from burnout. And then the next poll I ran was to, I guess, get us to dive a little deeper into what exactly we felt might be some of the causes of burnout. So as you can see, we had about 140 respondents to this poll, and the question was, in your experience, what do you think is the most common cause of burnout? And we had, as you can see, almost half of the respondents suggest that it came down to unmanageable workload. We also had lack of manager support coming in second with 24% of the community, unfair and inequitable treatment at 19%, and unclear communication at 14%. Now, the reason I wanted to run these polls again is just to help us firstly dive a little deeper into our own personal experiences and understand if and where we think that we have felt from burnout in the past, or if we've experienced burnout in the past, and also just set the scene to start understanding some of the components that we might consider to be contributors to burnout. So, as Sally is about to help us dive into, burnout is something that is very multifaceted and very complex. And historically, for many of us, it's something that we've had to battle and deal with on an individual level. Unfortunately, what Sally's study tells us is that it's actually a little bigger than that. We're going to need a little more support, particularly by way of our organization and a true culture shift in our organizations. So without any more on some of the findings of her study, I'm going to introduce you to Sally. So Sally Clarke is an author, a coach, and a burnout and well-being expert, working with clients around the globe to help them find meaning and authenticity at work and beyond. Sally herself actually burnt out as a finance lawyer at a top-tier firm and has since run communications and well-being businesses across 4 continents. Sally's latest book, Protect Your Spark, guides individuals on how to protect their unique spark from being extinguished by burnout. And Sally's co-author and co-researcher on the Global Workplace Burnout Study 2021 is Dr. John Chan. Unfortunately, he can't be with us here this evening, but I just want to give you a little more background on Dr. Chan as well. So he's the managing director of Infinite Potential. He's an organisational industrial psychologist with over 20 plus years of global experience designing people strategies to transform work into a place that empowers individuals to realise their whole potential. John's career has taken him from Silicon Valley startups to the NWSE and AX100 companies. John publishes in academic and media publications and regularly speaks at national and international conferences. So without further ado, I'm very excited to bring to you this evening Sally Clarke, who's going to be guiding us through a session on understanding burnout and helping us to define burnout. So welcome, Sally.
So thank you so much for inviting me to share on a topic that is really it's close to my heart. It's something that that I've been through personally, and I really appreciate the introduction that you've given in really sort of setting the stage. I think what's really important as a takeaway today is that we tend to have, I think, a little bit of a misunderstanding about what burnout is. And so what I'd like to leave you with today is a really clear picture of what burnout is, what it looks like. We're going to walk through some of the key findings from the study that Dr. Chan and I conducted, and then we'll throw it open to any questions that you might have. And so next week, as Alexis mentioned earlier, I'm presenting a second session to human leaders where we will delve into the some of those causes, the underpinnings of burnout, and also the solutions that leaders can use to really start to prevent burnout at an organisational and cultural level. So this tonight, we're really just going to focus on getting a really sort of visceral understanding of what burnout is. And before we delve in, I'm sharing a photo of myself that was taken a few months before I hit full burnout. So this is late 2009. I think it also gives a really clear depiction of how I was feeling at the time. I was working as a finance lawyer at one of Europe's top firms, and to the outside world, I had made it. I was in a very sought after role. My business card basically just said success. At the same time, I was utterly miserable. I was working 70 to 80-hour weeks. I felt really isolated and unsupported. My relationships were really suffering. My friendships had basically disintegrated because I was working all the time, and my primary relationship didn't survive the burnout. My health was also compromised. I was getting stress rashes, and I was losing weight without, just through the stress. And I also had some gastrointestinal issues. Most of all, my self-confidence was at an all-time low, but because of the prestige associated with the role, I persisted. So a few months after this photo was taken, I flew to Nantes, a little town in France, to visit my brother, who was doing a postdoc there. And when I entered the arrivals hall, I collapsed. I started crying and I couldn't stop. Looking back, I can see I was in a deep, dark burnout. At the time, I was really reluctant to use the term because it seemed to signify some kind of failure on my part. My thinking was, everyone else seems to be coping fine. There must be something wrong with me. And this is one of the tricky things about burnout. Because this mistaken idea persists that it results from some kind of personal failure, we keep pushing and trying and desperately willing things to be okay. So in 2019, the World Health Organization defined burnout for the first time, which is really exciting because it's been about 35 years of a lot of research and scientific attention placed on it. To see it recognized by the World Health Organization is key. So this is a shortened version of their definition. Burnout is a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress with 3 dimensions. So we're going to delve into the dimensions shortly. I just want to take a moment to break down that definition. So burnout is a syndrome. It's not a disease or an illness, which differentiates it from something like depression, for example. And it's caused by chronic workplace stress. So the World Health Organization has very much made burnout an occupational phenomenon. I think they have several reasons for doing so, and it helps us as researchers to really be able to focus burnout as a workplace issue to really help us find solutions. That chronic stress piece. So we all know what stress looks like. Chronic stress is low-level ongoing stress. So this can take months, if not years, to develop. It can also become quite sort of under the radar stress where you almost don't notice it's there anymore, and that is part of what makes it so dangerous. Burnout is expensive. It costs our economies hundreds of millions of dollars a year in turnover and lost productivity, in addition to the human cost. And Dr. Chan and I identified, as I mentioned, a number of organisational issues that underpin the chronic workplace stress that causes burnout. So I'll talk about that more next week, but just as a takeaway now, burnout is basically never the individual's fault. It's not a lack of trying or effort on the individual's part. Its causes are organisational and cultural. Burnout's not just a corporate phenomenon. It can happen in basically every industry. And it can also happen to entrepreneurs and students too. It tends to happen to highly intelligent, highly talented people. So thinking of people who, for example, have always got good grades at high school, really good grades at university, and they're used to doing a lot and getting away with it. And often this means that they are actually given more work by managers because they are just so competent and capable until they can't get away with it anymore. And burnout has quite a debilitating effect on it. So we're just going to take a brief look at what that effect is. So when there's a stressor, and I apologize if this is something that you're all more than familiar with already, but it's really important to sort of understand what happens to us in burnout. So stress activates our sympathetic nervous system, which makes us alert and ready to deal with whatever the perceived threat is. It might be a lion, it might be a deadline. So this is our fight, flight, or freeze response. And then when the threat passes, the lion's gone, the deadline has passed, our parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and tells the body that it's safe to relax and restore again. So all of the effort that's gone into addressing the threat, we can now relax and restore and retain that kind of healthy physiological balance. In chronic stress, the parasympathetic nervous system never gets its chance to allow the body to restore. We get stuck in this heightened alert mode. And eventually this constant state of alert wears down our systems. It compromises our physical, physiological, mental, emotional, and I would argue spiritual health. And when it goes on for years, it can have a detrimental impact on our health and well-being. So it's different to when you have maybe a project that ends and then you have some time, not just weekends or vacations, but also at work to sort of come back to a sense of stability and balance before you deal with the next stress. So chronic stress is low level and ongoing, and particularly when we're in burnout, we become easily quite sort of blind to its effects because of the dimensions of burnout that we experience, and it kind of becomes normalized. So as I mentioned, there are three dimensions of burnout as identified by researchers for several decades and as confirmed by the World Health Organization. So these are the dimensions that we look at when we are trying to establish whether someone is in burnout or not. So the first one is exhaustion, which is basically you are completely weary but incapable of rest. Often in burnout, there'll be quite intense sleep issues, which means we're just never able to achieve the amount of sleep that our body needs in order to restore. So the example we use here is Charlie, who's a CEO in burnout, and she's had sleep issues, has become short-tempered and forgetful. She's experiencing digestive issues and has started losing her hair. And I just want to highlight that these symptoms are not necessarily specific to the dimension. These are just sort of examples to bring it to life a little bit. So the second dimension is cynicism. And I certainly remember this one particularly clearly myself. It's a real withdrawal from your work and from the world at large. You lose trust in yourself and others. You lose intrinsic motivation for your work. And I really wasn't the best version of myself. And I think it was really this cynicism and a negativity that kind of crept in for me. So Greg, who's a designer, started feeling really disconnected from his colleagues, struggling to find motivation for work. He stopped exercising as much. He's experiencing a lower libido, and he's also experiencing loneliness. And that's probably something that for some people has become more prevalent in the last couple of years with working from home. The last dimension, reduced professional efficacy, which kind of sounds quite clinical, but is actually, for me, almost the most interesting dimension, because it occurs because in burnout, we start to lose our executive and cognitive function, which means brain fog, which can mean we actually lose some of our intellectual capacities, which is incredibly challenging for a lot of us who, for whom, you know, our intellects and work are really interconnected with our self-identity. And so the example we have here is Ahmed, who at 26 is already in burnout, and he started out working 12-hour days. He's now taking stimulants to work 16-hour days, started having panic attacks about work, and he's also started making a few mistakes recently when he had previously had a perfect track record. So again, that comes back to people who are incredibly competent and used to just sort of getting away with everything, and having the impact of burnout start to compromise their capacities. And it can be really difficult, I think, for leaders to deal with, because they're so used to crushing it and getting a lot of great feedback and having their approach really affirmed. So when they start to lose these capacities, it can trigger a lot of fear and even panic. And often, instead of acknowledging what's happening, they'll enter into a state of denial, and I certainly did myself. So we sort of deny that anything is wrong, everything is fine, and the idea of actually admitting that we're burnt out can become quite scary. We'll push it off until there's no other option. The combination of these, and this isn't part of the World Health Organization definition, but often what I see is the combination of these dimensions gives rise to a kind of existential questioning. a lot of my clients sort of feel like they don't know themselves anymore. They may not like themselves anymore. They find themselves doing things that don't feel authentic or genuine. As a client of mine actually put it to me yesterday when she was at her deepest point of burnout, she said, "I didn't have a soul." So that's the kind of overriding feeling, which is obviously pretty terrifying to experience. I think we can imagine that there's also, for leaders, there's quite a lot of impact on your leadership style and what you're capable of doing when you're subject to burnout. So the 2021 Global Workplace Burnout Study, we had over 3,200 respondents from 30 countries, and we used the Infinite Potential Burnout Scale, which is a complex scale that's used to derive accurate data on burnout. Because as Alexis mentioned earlier, what we see in a lot of studies is that people basically ask the question, do you feel burnt out right now? So it's a lot of self-reporting and that sort of direct answer. And quite understandably, a lot of us might think that we're burnt out when in actual fact, we are not in burnout according to the World Health Organization definition. So it's probably a little bit the former lawyer in me that's a little definition obsessed, but I think it's really important that we're clear on how we use this term. We don't overuse it. We're really specific about what we mean. So perhaps unsurprisingly, year-on-year burnout trended up by 5% from 2020 into 2021. So around 34.7% of respondents are in burnout. Per dimension, we also saw an increase, and particularly in exhaustion, that trended up over the last year. And based on age, burnout has basically sort of slightly increased for most age groups, other than the 45 to 54 age group category, which saw a significant jump from 31 to 39% over the last year. And we actually had only a few respondents. You see NA in the 55 to 64 age group category, not enough respondents to formulate any data. So hoping to get more participants in that age group category next year so we can continue to build that data set. Females tend to be more burnt out than males, but we are seeing a fairly strong trend in men becoming burnt out as well. So that's up almost 6% in the last year to 31.7%. And I think that's, so women are still ahead, but men are rapidly catching up. Another interesting statistic that we derived from the study was we also asked people to rate the level of organisational support that they receive. And those who are not experiencing burnout reported that they feel much more supported by their organisation at 73%, and those who are in burnout, 33% lower. It's a pretty significant gap there. So we also measured respondents' well-being, which is kind of another side of the coin, just to get a full picture of how people are doing at the moment. And we saw a 4% drop from 2020 to 2021, 45 out of 100 overall well-being. And we can see here also the correlation between being burnt out and lack of well-being, with those who are not experiencing burnout rating at about 66 out of 100, and those who are experiencing burnout at 31. So it has a really drastic effect on your well-being. Just quickly, the highest level of burnout both years was at middle management level. This year we've seen a shift in the lowest level of well-being from intermediate level to middle management. So middle management is clearly really being hit hard at the moment. Another thing we really wanted to look at was to measure the impact of burnout on productivity and quality of work as a kind of way of bringing home to senior leaders in particular just how drastic the impact of burnout is on their organisation and their teams. And I was frankly pretty shocked by the results. It's pretty extreme. So you can see that in the last year, those who are in burnout was 73% of those who were in burnout were less productive, so significantly lower compared to 29% of those who are not experiencing burnout. And really interestingly, so less than 1% of burnt out people rated themselves as being more productive, but 37% of people who are not experiencing burnout considered themselves to have been more productive in the last year. Interesting to speculate about what the reasons might be there, but it's a fairly significant difference. Similarly, in terms of quality of work, so we're seeing people who are in burnout, 56% are producing a lower quality of work compared to just 16% of those who are not experiencing burnout. And again, better quality of work, less than 1% for those who are in burnout, and 39% for those who are not in burnout. So again, interesting to kind of think about the reasons that might be occurring in terms of changes in the workplace we've seen and the increase in working from home. Hope I'm not racing too fast. So this is one of my favorite parts of the study, because we were really looking to, we know that burnout's really prevalent. We really wanted to understand why and what the solutions might be. So we asked participants to sort of pick what from a short list of about 10 options, what would most alleviate their work-related stress. Do they want free lunches? Do they want meditation apps? What kind of changes do they want to see their organisations making to support them? So the top 3 answers at organisational level were to embed wellness as part of the business strategy and culture, review role responsibilities to ensure workload is manageable, and increase manager capacity to understand burnout and identify stresses. At a manager level, the top 4 responses were: number 1, have a better understanding of their team's workload. Number 2, push back on unreasonable expectations from clients and stakeholders. Number 3, champion and role model well-being behaviours. And number 4, protect weekends and days off. So no work or contact over weekends or days off. And then in terms of sort of general ideas, the top 3 answers were: number 1, ability to take a mental health day without question. Number 2, to receive more recognition from leaders. And number 3, allocate time to learn new skills and capabilities. So what I really love about this is people are clearly very fluent and understand, very clear on what they see as what they need from organisations and managers in order to support them and mitigate that the stress that to which they are exposed that ultimately can lead to burnout. So we also just asked people sort of if there's anything else that they had to share some ideas. So here are a few of them. Have clear priorities. I currently have 3 people telling me all their requests are a priority. Repair toxic workplace cultures and remove poor leadership. Lead by example, be less condescending. I think one that particularly stands out for me is leadership at the very top needs to practice what they preach and stop making last-minute requests at night and during the weekend. They talk about work-life balance, but don't allow anyone to actually have it. So I think this disconnect between what leadership says and then how they behave and what their expectations are really has huge consequences for workplace culture. And next week we'll delve into looking at some of those specific causes that we see, and also some of the solutions that leaders can implement right now to start shifting the dial in terms of workplace culture. This is a lot of information. I just want to share some key takeaways with you before we shift to questions, which I can hopefully answer for you. So burnout is a syndrome caused by chronic workplace stress, 3 dimensions: exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced efficacy. It affects highly intelligent and talented people and can take months and years to develop. It can also take a really long time to recover from. So burnout is on the rise. It's up 5% year on year in 2021, and it has a really serious impact on productivity and quality of work. And I'd say in addition to the detrimental impact that it can have at an individual level. And also I think on colleagues and people around those who are in burnout. Leaders at all levels can take action to help prevent burnout, and we'll delve into that next week. Thank you so much. Alexis, if you'd like to
Yeah, Sally, thank you so much. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. And the pertinent takeaway for me, both when I met Sally for the first time and dived into some of her research, were these three key dimensions of burnout that I frankly had no idea about. And for so many of us, I think that we associate burnout with exhaustion. That seems to be the most key indicator of how we're feeling. We're really knackered all the time. You know, we're just feeling tired. We wake up in the morning and we feel like we're not rested, and then we're getting to work and we're feeling home and there's no rest, and we're on emails. And exhaustion tends to be, I think, the most easy one to identify for so many of us. So I think that's just so important for people to understand and for us to have more language around those dimensions. And as you mentioned, it creates a way greater capacity for us as leaders and as organizations to be proactive and preventative about it now that we have the language and we have a clear understanding of those dimensions, how to spot it, what it looks like, and some of those preventative measures. So thank you so much, Sally. Personally, hearing your own personal experience in that as well. And I very much can resonate with that. I worked in corporate marketing for a good chunk of my career in my early 20s. And I have always felt personally drawn to the topic of burnout myself, having probably for a 2-year period suffered that low grade chronic stress. I remember distinctly having a headache behind my eyes, I think, for 2 full years, waking up in the morning, dreading the day, feeling already tired. You know, the cynicism, you know, the detachment from other people, I resonate. And it's certainly something that we need to be taking more seriously. And I think studies like this, again, help us to highlight exactly what it looks like, how we define it, how we dive into these dimensions, and so that we can start being preventative about this in a systemic and way in our organizations to truly change the culture. So fantastic session, Sally. Thank you so much. Now we're going to open it up, guys. Does anyone have any questions for Sally that they would like to pitch to her? We appreciate that. Again, there's so much depth to this body of research, which is why we've broken it into 2 sessions to try and cram everything in. Today would have been a bit of an information overload and wouldn't allow for us to have some question time. So there'll be another chunk of it that we'll be covering next week as well. So we've got a question here coming through from Jack. Is the incidence of burnout greater now than, say, 4 or 5 years ago? And if so, why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jack. Thanks for asking. Based on the research that I've seen, it certainly is on the up, basically trending upwards over the last decade. And there has been a lot more attention paid to it, I think, which is also sort of contributing to this awareness of it. It's a term that we hear a lot more. People are bringing more awareness to it, which is really valid. The reasons I would say for that, I mean, I think it partly depends a little bit on the location. I'm based in the Netherlands. I've spent time in the US and Australia. And I think it depends a little bit on sort of from country to country to some extent. But I think the general sort of job insecurity can be a big factor for people. I certainly saw that in the US, people really worrying for their jobs, particularly in 2020 when there were a lot of furloughs and layoffs. And I think in sort of more generally, we've experienced, and I don't like to use hyperbole or anything. Life is always to some extent very uncertain, but I think we're feeling a great deal of uncertainty, certainly over the last 2 or 3 years in life and in our work environments. And that is absolutely a contributing factor to that chronic workplace stress.
Sally, I actually had a question as you were speaking earlier. The 3 dimensions of burnout, so the exhaustion, the cynicism, and reduced efficacy. To be considered burnt out, does one need to exhibit factors of all 3, or are you finding some are higher in certain areas than others? What are the sort of trends around that?
Yeah, so we have sort of a threshold. You have to be at a certain level on all 3 of the dimensions to qualify as being in burnout. And as you mentioned, I think the exhaustion factor is one that pretty much everyone who is, lived through the last few years is familiar with on some level, whether it's ourselves or people that we're close to. So it's really making sure that we pay equal attention to the three dimensions to catch also the reduced professional efficacy and also the cynicism factor. And for me, the cynicism factor is really kind of interesting because that's where we sort of see that disconnect from self, withdrawal from our environment. And I would almost say withdrawal from self. There's this disconnect between who we really are and who we day to day feel like we were almost, a client of mine described it to me as like living behind glass. Like I'm not really living. And I think that's definitely down to the cynicism factor.
Yeah, brilliant, Sally. And I know in my personal experience, I think exhaustion was sort of the first step down the path, and then the continued exhaustion, the continued frustration with unmanageable workloads then sort of led to those feelings of cynicism, and eventually also in my case was that level of reduced efficacy, not believing anymore that I had enough time or had the capacity to get the work done. So it sounds as though there seems to be sort of at least a somewhat linear path that leaders might be able to start picking up on maybe where someone's at in that burnout journey. Was that sort of something that you would assume from the research as well?
Actually not specifically. The three dimensions can happen, basically, they can sort of unfold in their own way. It's such a personal thing, and this makes it really quite hard to make any generalizations about burnout. But certainly the exhaustion factor, that can actually have a fairly detrimental and fast impact on our sense of perspective and objectivity. So one of the things that happens very often in burnout is we lose sight of the fact that we have options. We get stuck in this, in that alert response where we're really just sort of, quite tense and unable to sort of relax and see the bigger picture. And I think that's definitely part of the sort of the exhaustion. We just lose sight of what's actually really going on. So it's not linear. I would say that burnout is a spectrum, that the burnout as a concept is something that you can be, sort of on the spectrum at any point. But unfortunately, it's not sort of a step-by-step definitive way of sort of seeing it. The signals that I think leaders can look out for are those indications of exhaustion, or if you do see mistakes, rather than just pouncing on the mistake, thinking about why that might have happened for that person, and just having an open conversation and dialogue ongoing with people, so that they are in a position where they feel safe to talk about the stress that they're experiencing.
Yeah, and I think that as a leader, cluing into those indications is really important, isn't it? And as you mentioned, Sally, this happens to highly intelligent, capable people. It's not a failure of oneself to be suffering from burnout. It is a systemic issue with, a plethora of issues within the organization. So I think that leaders, there is a huge piece here for us to take radical responsibility in, owning that problem, being part of that problem and being part of the solution of that problem as well. I think certainly in my experience, it was something that I felt left to deal with. Well, you need to take a break, or you need to do this, or you need to do that. But there was never the safety to say, oh, your job will be here when you get back, or we'll help job share and things like that. And so I think sometimes people can be maybe pushed to handle it on their own, which is quite a scary position to be in for a lot of individuals as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important point that we tend to feel. And I think that plays out quite well for organizations when the narrative is that burnout is the individual's fault and the individual's responsibility, and you need to time manage more, and you need to have better morning routine and get up, drink your lemon water and you won't burn out kind of thing. And that pushback onto individuals is really convenient for organizations. However, it's not eradicating the root cause of the chronic stress that gives rise to burnout. I think by definition, when we're in chronic stress, it makes it almost impossible. It's very difficult to then extract ourselves from it. So that's why there's a real opportunity for leaders to be creating different kinds of cultures and creating a situation where the organization itself becomes almost chronic stress free. I think that's a real possibility that we're going to see in the next few years of organisations shifting to that kind of model. And I think people finding that really attractive, and that being a huge, talent attractor.
Yeah, well, Sally. And so what I'm really hearing here is that, as an individual, there are things that we can do to take care of ourselves, but essentially without leadership and without organizations on board systemically making changes, it's kind of like trying to put a fire out by blowing on the smoke as an individual, because you're not actually smothering the flame that's causing the burnout for you underneath, because you're not actually necessarily capable of doing that. There has to be that connection between individuals making an effort to, take care of their own well-being, but there systemically has to be change at an organizational level to actually reinforce or allow for that to happen.
Absolutely. And I think it's going to take some courage for leaders, because it's in a lot of industries, it's kind of in a comfort zone. I think particularly my experience is in the legal field, where they're actually quite comfortable with that rate of attrition of losing people to burnout, because they have a whole row of sort of fresh graduates who are willing to sort of step in. But I think what we are going to see is as we shift in organizational culture, that courageous leaders who are able to build a genuinely safe, chronic stress-free environment where people can innovate and people can be themselves is really going to be the way forward, and a huge differentiating factor for the future.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Sally. And we're getting some great comments here in the chat. Sandra's mentioned that she resonates really with this a lot. In burnout, she felt she had zero options, and I thought I had to just retire as I was over the hill. Stepping out from it, and now 6 months on, I can see my options and finally feel well again, motivated and reconnecting with what brings me joy. I'm very delighted to hear that, Sandra, and I'm sorry that you've experienced that awful syndrome. I too know what it feels like to feel very trapped and unsure of the way forward in that. So thank you for sharing that. We've got a few questions coming through as well. I'll start with Caitlin, and she's just asked, how do you help a peer who you can see is approaching or experiencing burnout, Sally? Do you have any advice on that one at all?
Yeah, so I published a book in November on the individual ways that we can sort of fortify ourselves against burnout. As much as the causes are organisational, I think it's kind of the book that I would have liked to force myself to read in maybe 2007. I'm also next month publishing one on recovery from burnout. I think as a friend, it can be really difficult to see someone go through that, partly because, speaking also from my own experience and from what I see with clients, denial, sort of self-righteous denial, can be a really big component when we're so afraid of the consequences of what admitting that we might be in burnout are. We can become quite, that tension just really sort of comes in. So I would say be a compassionate listener, maybe express your concerns in a really non-judgmental way, and just try and create a safe space for that person to have a haven to go to talk to about what they're really going through. I think, or maybe just saying, I went to a workshop on burnout and it kind of made me think of you. Can we chat or something? And just kind of bringing it in that way might be a helpful way of broaching the topic.
Yeah, great advice there, Sally. And I think it comes back a little bit to that existential component of it, doesn't it? And I certainly know in my experience, it was an utter disbelief that a person, of my aptitude could suffer from burnout. I felt that I was successful and burnout was failure, and therefore it was felt like an attack on my identity at that point. And I fully appreciate how difficult that can be to have that conversation with other people as well. For sure.
Yeah,
now we've got a great,
my ego hated burnout.
Yeah. It's deeply uncomfortable, especially when we do associate it with personal failure. So I think having that understanding that this is an organizational issue, more so than anything, really opens the door for us to say, hey, look, I'm struggling, and this isn't my fault. This is something we need to deal with. So now we've got a great comment coming here from Dermot. He's asked, is it common to see a group or department-wide burnout?
It's actually a really great question, Dermot, and it is, the research shows that burnout can have a kind of, not a contagious effect, But I think it does also make logical sense when we think about the chronic stress that gives rise to burnout, that if one person in a team is exposed to it for those organisational factors, it's fairly unsurprising that other people in the team will be susceptible. And that might mean, and I'm not placing any judgment on managers whatsoever, but if there is a toxic manager, or if there is a work stream that is simply unsustainable, we do tend to see that it is something that will affect groups and departments even. Yeah, so that's something definitely that occurs. And it's also something that, if someone is sort of burnt out and starting to feel really quite cynical, that in itself can also be a difficult one for other colleagues to work with or work around. And again, I'm speaking from my own experience. I was not a fun person.
Yeah, I totally concur with that experience as well, though, Sally. And in the marketing world that I worked in, and I wonder if you can maybe comment on this at all. We had a certain element of our job was business development, so sales essentially. And I wonder if there are particular industries that have that high competitive, inter-team competitive nature. Do you see that tends to drive more burnout? Like, are there certain industries that should be watching out for this more than others?
I would say all industries should really be watching out for it, but it's certainly one where, the isolation factor is quite strong. So I think if we don't feel supported by our organisation, that heightens our sense of chronic stress, of our sense of needing to be individually alert to deal with threats and stresses, because we don't have the support of the team more broadly. I think, it is something where, we do see it in certain industries where there is a sort of a cutthroat environment, that it's that it is heightened simply because people are willing to subjugate their own needs to do what they think is necessary in order to meet the target, to meet the goals. At the same time, that sort of, I think it really is prevalent in so many areas. And I think sometimes we may not see that a particular industry is really competitive, but I have heard anecdotally from healthcare people in the healthcare industry that there's very much that kind of cutthroat environment there as well, whereas I hadn't personally associated with that. So that certainly contributes to burnout too.
Yeah, and I guess it manifests in different ways given on the profession in terms of how that competition looks like. So I guess that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Now we've got a great question from Jen here, and she's asked, with polyvagal theory awareness, so the nervous system awareness component, and mind-body interaction, did you see the prevalence of chronic disease and autoimmune diseases in those? Was it higher in those with burnout? Did you get any data around that at all?
No, I'm really grateful for the question though, Jen. That's really a matter that's close to my heart, with several really close friends in that situation. Based on we didn't test that within this study, but it is something we may turn our attention to in the 2022 study. Just my instinct is that there is potentially a correlation, just because of the potentially the lower threshold that you might have to deal with chronic stress. Therefore, that threshold being crossed at an earlier time and more significantly. But my instinct is that's absolutely there would be a higher prevalence. Unfortunately, I don't have the data at the moment.
Yeah, and it is interesting, Sally, and I think a lot of people don't always obviously associate how stress has that longer term physiological effect on the body, which can, result in triggering some of these autoimmune diseases as well. And again, I know in my case, I've not suffered an autoimmune disease, but I certainly had a lot of digestion issues and skin issues and headache issues and things that, I got given glasses by an optometrist for ongoing migraines because I was using a screen too often. So I think there is still a lot of dots for us to connect between some of the signs that our body is giving us and, what's actually going on as well.
Mm.
Yeah, great question, Jen. Thank you for raising that one. And Dermot's asked a question here as well. Given the personal issues we're all facing, I guess more junior employees can burn out, not just higher achievers.
I think that's, again, a great question. And I think that's absolutely the case. And I think it's almost, it's not just the junior employees, but I have, I'm aware of clients that are come to me in their third burnout in their 50s. So it can be something that sort of can repeat through life. I think for me, the key question is not necessarily age, but level of self-awareness. And I don't want to go too much down the track of individuals should be preventing their own burnout. But what tends to happen is when we rush into careers and we're high achievers, there can be a lack of sort of questioning of whether what we're doing actually truly aligns with our own values. So I think one of the key questions is, and I set this out in my book, that there's a focus on self-compassion, self-knowledge, and self-awareness. And when we really work with these, again, if I could time travel back to 2007, I would force myself to read the book, to really get aware of what our actual intrinsic needs are, and not those that we might have internalized or taken on from other sources. So that self-awareness piece, I think, is really important. Probably more, you might see it more with junior people because they just haven't reached a middle age where they're like, who am I? But I think it does sort of tend to happen. It can still happen across age groups.
Yeah, that's such a great explanation for that, Sally. I really appreciate that. And it's something, within our human leaders model that we look at as well, is that understanding of values and vision and how that overlaps with our responsibility to find what the right fit is for us, in the environments and the styles of work we want to do as well. And certainly I prescribed from a young age to an industry and an expectation that I now know isn't the right fit for me, and was, played a huge role in, my experience and my stress and things like that as well. So, all right, we have some big questions coming through here. So I'll start with Anya. She's asked, great question, Anya, very timely. Can the organization's work arrangement, so in-office, remote, hybrid, distributed, etc., can that have any effect on burnout at all, Sally?
The short answer is absolutely. And the slightly longer answer is, I think what's key here is not so much the nature of it's partly the nature of how we work, but it's the involvement of the individual in that decision-making process. So if there is, if people are allowed to have some involvement into what extent they work in office, whether it's hybrid, whatever works for them, I think the organization understanding like life, we all have lives outside of work, and we really need to honor who we are as a whole person. So if we're expecting people to come to the workplace as their whole self, we need to honor that there are going to be changes in that, whether it's changes in caring responsibilities or personal needs shifting. So I think more important than the work arrangement is how it's established. Is it something where that people are given the scope to define it themselves? I think, bluntly, any organization that's saying everyone has to come back to the office full time, you're probably going to see an uptick in burnout, quite frankly.
And I guess that just comes back into that piece around that relationship with management, doesn't it, Sally, and the communication and opening that safety to have those conversations and find the right flexibility fit for workers, doesn't it?
Absolutely essential.
Yeah, great. And now we've got another question coming in here, and it's quite a long one, so I'm going to do my best with it. If a company changes the workload and makes the improvements needed, does that mean that the person will recuperate quickly, or is there sort of some kind of time frame that we can expect around this? Or is it sort of once they've burnt out, perhaps they need a fresh start altogether? Is there any data around that for us at all, Sally?
Yeah, I think the data, the research, and my personal experience shows that unfortunately, due to the physical and physiological, mental, emotional, even spiritual impact that I mentioned on the individual person, unfortunately, shifting those mechanisms around will not actually heal that person from the damage that is being caused by burnout instantaneously. That takes time. What those kind of shifts will mean is that it might enable the person to return more quickly to the work environment, or to heal perhaps a little faster if they're given the space and time that they need. And I'm just conscious that there's people from a lot of different countries who are listening. And I'm in the Netherlands, where there is a protocol as to how what people can do when they are in burnout that actually gives a lot of space and time for that recovery, which is for a lot of people essential. So unfortunately, great if the company changes the workload and makes those, organizational shifts to prevent burnout. But once someone is in burnout, they are going to need that time for their body and their soul, as it were, to heal.
Yeah, absolutely, Sally. And I think the same question goes on to say, or suggest rather, that it can leave that lasting and deeper dissatisfaction with the organization at a whole at that point. And I think that points to burnout being something we really need to look at preventatively, because it will damage things like trust, and it will damage things like that employee relationship with the company on the long term, won't it?
Certainly, yeah. And I have clients that I work with as a burnout coach who do stay at the same company in return and will stay and be quite happy. I chose to quit, and I was very privileged to have that option at the time. And it is something that I think for a lot of people, it's almost like a relationship that it does have that quality of you've been burned, you've been really quite, damaged in some ways by that relationship. It can make it very hard unless there's really significant change to enter into and feel like you're going to be in a safe space.
Yeah, and I guess that cynicism can be sort of directed towards the company at that point as well, to an extent, can't it?
Yeah, it's going to be something where it's some people have drawn a comparison between the effects of burnout and trauma. So I think, when you have had that sort of traumatic impact of burnout, it can be, for some clients, we do get to the point where they're very clear that going back to it will actually be a re-traumatizing event. There's actually research done to show that for some people who've been through burnout, going back to the same building and even going back to a similar building to where they had burnout can bring up all kinds of sensations in their body and real anxiety. So it is something where, again, if someone is in a privileged position where they have some options, and that's something as a coach, obviously, I really help them find, then it can be worthwhile looking elsewhere. I would personally say that quitting that firm was the best decision I've ever made in my life.
Yeah, I would have to concur with that in my experience as well, Sally. For me at the time, it was the only option. But as you mentioned, that's a privileged opportunity, and one that not all of us have, depending on the situation. So I appreciate you taking the time to really work through that with us. Now, guys, I'm very conscious we have had your attention now for an hour, which we're very, very appreciative of. Does anyone have any closing comments while we have Sally? Sandra's mentioned here, in my experience as a HR professional, it is the trust impacted significantly. Yeah. And even although they return to work with support in place, they are heightened state of awareness, scanning for repeat organizational behaviors. Absolutely, Sandra. And I think that alludes to that trauma response, really, to an extent, doesn't it? When we have been impacted at a level, and certainly I would say in my situation, it was a lot of interpersonal relationships, which caused me quite a deep anxiety that I felt. I was always looking over my shoulder to try and avoid certain people, and I felt that I couldn't relax in the job anymore, even when I had, sort of begun to deal with it. And so there's certainly that absence of psychological safety at an organizational level can really, really exacerbate that issue, I suppose.
Certainly. I think that's exactly it. We're going back, we're trying to recover from chronic stress, and then we're going back to an environment that re-triggers that heightened sense of alertness. The sympathetic nervous system goes back into effect, and it just can become too difficult to really trust and to really be able to relax in an environment that's caused so much harm. And I think, just to highlight what Sandra said as well, that psychological safety is a really key aspect of burnout prevention. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week, but that is a really important area of focus for all organizations right now.
Yeah, absolutely, Sally. Now, I am going to wrap us up there, guys. Firstly, I would love to say a huge thank you to you, Sally, for being so gracious with your incredible report, and really helping us to dive deeper to get the language that we need and understand these dimensions of burnout. It gives us so much power as leaders and as HR professionals in organizations to take preventative measures in how we deal with burnout. Now, on that, as Sally mentioned, we will be diving into another session next week, which will cover the second half of the session today, which really looks at preventative measures for leaders and for organizations to dive into this more. So what I've done is popped up a QR code here. If you would like to get a copy of the Global Workplace Burnout Study 2021, please give that a scan rather. And at the bottom there's also the direct link to that, which is on the infinitepotential.com.au website, which is Dr. John Chan's website. Next week's session, we will be hosting exclusively within the Human Leaders community. This session, again, we're going to be diving much more into the preventative measures that we can take in mitigating burnout within our organizations. So if you aren't already a member of the Human Leaders platform, I would implore you to join us. We have over 55 live expert-led sessions annually. We work on a subscription base, so you can have access to sessions like this with Sally, fantastic live leadership circles and other leadership challenges through the month for only $25 a month as part of Human Leaders. So please do give that QR code a scan or join us over at www.wearehumanleaders.com. We would be delighted to have you join us and delighted to have such a great session full of incredible leaders and fantastic questions coming through for next week's session as well. So again, thank you all for joining us this evening, this morning, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you so much to Sally for your incredible research and incredible discussion around this topic.
Thanks so much, Alexis. It's been a total pleasure, and I'm really grateful seeing some lovely comments come through. Thank you so much. Really excited to share the results of the study, and also just give, like you said, I think it's so important that we have the language to talk about this, and so we can really understand it. That's critical to making the change that we need to see.
Yeah, absolutely agreed, Sally, and I can't wait for us to dive even deeper into our understanding of this next week and start to learn some practical, strategic, preventable tools for us to start combating burnout at an organizational level. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. Again, we'll be hosting another session live at wearehumanleaders.com next week with Sally, covering the second half of the Global Workplace Burnout Study 2021.